continue our learning. So we finished on Tes Vav Amud Beis at the top, and we stopped. And I said we're going to pick up. We just have to go back just a little bit to review, so we get a running start to where we are today. The topic still continues to be, although I think we're getting to the end of the topic maybe this week, is the topic of whether or not if someone when someone buys a field, whether it's because he buys it from a goslin or there is a mortgage property, either way, and it's significant, there's different answers for either one. But if someone buys that property and then the rightful owner or the creditor comes back and claims the property, if the property was improved and the buyer claims that improvement, then we've been saying now for weeks that this gives rise to a question of ribis, to interest, because the definition of ribis is when I give you money for a purpose, let's say it's a loan or a sale, I give you money, and during the time that you have the money, something happens that when you return the money, you return more than I gave you, that by all appearances, it's ribis. And of course, we say it's either actual ribis or mechzek ribis, as Rashi had said. It appears to be ribis. It may not be ribis, but it appears to be ribis, and that's a problem. So the question here becomes, now in our Gemara here, we said that Shmuel says, Shmuel is the one who has this issue, who raises this issue of ribis, and Shmuel says that when a balchov comes and collects, he can collect on the shvach, on the improvement. So that's what gave rise to the question. So the Gemara wants to answer on the bottom of Tes Vav and Aleph. Essentially, we can answer Shmuel whether it's a purchase from a goslin or a balchov, a creditor situation. And we said that in the case of a goslin, it's not ribis if the goslin himself has other property. So he's not repaying money, but he has other property. Or where he announces in advance at the time that I'm selling this property, but if for some reason the buyer must give up the property, then I'm ensuring that any work he did on the property is his, not a problem. Why is that not ribis? Because again, the definition of ribis is that you receive something you didn't bargain for when the money was already paid. In other words, the money is out of your hands, and now you're getting back more money than you bargained for. But if the seller says before the money is exchanged, the seller says, if there's a problem with this sale, I'm going to pay you for all of your work and all of the improvement of the land, then by definition, it can't be ribis because this pronouncement was made prior to the activity of the exchange of money. And since ribis can only be defined as money earned when your money was no longer in your possession because you gave it out, here, that didn't happen. The money that you earned, so to speak, you earned even before you gave him the money because the seller said, I'm going to compensate you if there's a problem with this sale. So he already initially vitiated the whole issue of ribis by saying, I'm going to compensate you. All right. So that's the tariff.
What if if he says he's going to compensate him and it's above market value?
No. So above market value is not the subject here. So that's not ribis, because then you're talking about, again, if it's the case of a balchov and he didn't say it beforehand that he can't give it to him, We're talking about above market value in the sense that there is shvach, that there's improvement to the land. So the improvement to the land is what he's willing to pay him in advance. Anything that he doesn't announce that he's paying him in advance, you can't give him. He can't give him anything that he didn't say, I'm going to give you. It's only because he said in advance, I'm going to give you, that it takes it out of the whole box of ribbis, which is the unknown of what's going to happen when he makes the transaction. Is he going to get more than he bargained for?
Well, I
Rabbi?
guess my point
Okay.
is that if if um if I say I'm going to give you $50 for any improvements that you've made if this doesn't go through, but he only did $25 worth of improvements, is that that additional 25 ribbis?
No, no. But if he said, I'm going to give you 50 and the improvements are 100,
Then that would be the
then he
50,
can't.
the 50 on top of that would be.
That's correct, because that he didn't bargain for. Yeah, go ahead.
So why, just thinking from contracts, so why wouldn't this language, this pre-sale language, why wouldn't this be pro forma? Why wouldn't this be part of every single negotiation? You throw it in there just on the off chance that things don't work out, you don't have the ribis issue.
Well, in essence, Yale, that's what the heter iska does.
Oh.
The heter iska that we've created is what gives us the right to collect that money, because in effect we have prevented or preempted. We have preempted the ribis issue. So you're absolutely correct.
Thank you.
You're absolutely correct. So, all right. So now that we've defined what it is, so the Gemara at the very end of last week, we said that by Balchov, there's no kasha. Why is there no kasha? Because there's a difference between whether or not he sold him a property that had a wheat, let's say, or harvest that was reached the shoulders, meaning it was literally ready to be cut, or not. So Rashi said that in the case where it's Magbiya Liksofim, where the wheat is up to the shoulders, meaning it's literally ready to be cut, then of course the buyer is entitled to the money or to his expense. Remember that the Gemara there said that you could either give him the improvement or the expense. So meaning that if the improvement was $200 and the expense was 100, if he gives him 100, then he's not out of pocket. Okay, so the Balchov is not required, the creditor is not required to pay him for the value of the shvach, at least only to the value of the expense. Conversely, if the expense is greater than the shvach, then he only has to give him expense up to the amount of the shvach. But and again, the Gemara made that distinction between, now if the produce was not reaching the shoulder, meaning that it was bare, that it was in its infancy, then the Gemara says that's the situation where he doesn't have to give him any, he doesn't have to really give him anything. Correct, the Gemara, but we see Shmuel, when he answered shilas to other people, said that you have to pay regardless of whether it reached that height or not. So the Gemara answered, and this is our takeoff point, Lo kasha, 4 lines, 3 lines, 4 lines from the bottom, from the top. Lo kasha hoda mosik be shiur ara v'shavcha, where the claimant claimed the land and the produce, he has to give him shvach. Hoda lo masik be ela shiur ara, but if he only claimed, in other words, his debt was only the amount of the land, not the shvach, the yov le shavche u'misalik le, that he has to give him the value of the shvach, and then he can dismiss him from the field. So in other words, this answer says that when Shmuel answered shilas, there were 2 circumstances, 2 different fact patterns. One where the claimant claimed land and produce, in which case that's what he has to pay him, land and produce. But where he claimed only land because that was all he was entitled to, then he gives him the land. He has to return over the land. Of course, the land he collects from the seller, so it's not a problem. But that the Balchov, the creditor, then has to pay the shvach because that's enrichment, and then he dismisses him from the field. So that's the Gemara's answer, and that's how we left. Now, we're going to start from here. There's an interesting machlokes in the Gemara in Ksubis. The Gemara asks the following question. if a person sells a piece of property and then there's a balchov. Okay, it has to do with the ksuba there. So it's not the identical fact pattern, but it's similar. And someone now has to collect on that land. The question is, land is worth more than money. Okay, that's a given because land is something that money is money. It is what it is. Yes, there's inflation, it may go up a little bit, but land by its very definition is an investment that improves and has more value. So as between having $100 of money or $100 of land, presumably someone who understands will say, I'd rather have $100 worth of land. So there's a machlekes there in ksubas. When a person comes to collect on land, can the person who owns the land, who now is the balabos of the land, and the creditor wants to get the land from him, does the buyer have any rights? What does that mean? Does he have rights? Can he say, I don't want to, your chov is $1,000. I have money in my pocket. I'll give you $1,000. I want to keep the land. Here's your $1,000. Okay, new issue. Can the buyer of land, which has a mortgage, say to the mortgagee, I don't want to give you the land? Now, we know in commerce, right, that today, if the mortgagee was a bank, the bank would say, sure, give us the land, give us the money, we don't want your land, because banks don't want property, they want money. But if he's an investor and he says, this land has value to me, I don't want to give it up. I've got $1,000 in the bank. Here, take $1,000. Machlekes in the Gemara, whether he's allowed to do that, or whether the Baal Chov has to accept the money or not. In other words, does he have to accept the fact that the buyer wants to give him money and keep the property, or can he say, this is my property, it's mortgaged, I want the property, you keep the money? That's the machlokes in ksubas. Now, how is it going to play out here? So we just said now, what did we just say? We just said now that if a creditor comes and says, I have a loan on this property, but the shvach is not part of my loan. Here, I'll pay you and walk away. Now it's ripe for this discussion. Zok the Gemara Azai. He nichal Manda Omar. Our Gemara is correct according to the Manda Omar, who says, if the buyer of the property has money, he can't dismiss the Baal Chov and say, here's the money. You keep the money, I'll keep the land. Shapir. Elamanda Omar, according to the one who says, if the lokeach, the buyer, has enough money, he can dismiss the Baal Chov and say, here's your $1,000, I want the land. Nema le ilui, let this buyer in our case say, if I had money, I would have redeemed the entire land and given you the money. Now that I don't have money to redeem the land, then give me a corner of the land up to the value of my shvach. I improved this land by, let's say, 1/10, $100. The property's worth 1,000. I improved it 1/10. Give me 1/10 of the land because I'm entitled to redeem the entire land according to this Manda Omar. You understand the kasha? So according to the Manda Omar, who says that you can redeem the land and that the Baal Chov does not have preference over you, the buyer, then let this buyer say, I want a piece of the action. I want a percentage of the land equal to my shvach, and you can't do anything about it. Then that's a kasha on our Gemara, because our Gemara just said what? That if the claimant comes and says, this is my land, but I only have a claim up to the value of the land, not the shvach, he's allowed to pay off the the shvach and kick him off the land. Why should he be able to kick him off the land? According to the Manda Omar, that a lokeach has kedima, that a buyer has preference over the Baal Chov and can say to the Baal Chov, here's your money. Let this buyer say, I have a stake in this land. What's my stake? The amount of the improvement, the shvach, in which case it's a problem, right? Okay, let's look at Rashi. So in other words, it's an interesting shaila because of this machlokes and ksubis, whether a buyer has rights over a mortgagee, right? It's a practical issue. Who has rights in the case where there's a mortgage property and the mortgage property is sold to a third person and the mortgagee comes back and says, I want the property. Again, today, in cases of mortgage, where most of the mortgages are held by, let's say, financial institutions, they don't want land. They want money, not an issue. But where land is a premium and where someone wants the land and he argues, it's my land, can the buyer say, no, it's not your land. I bought this land. I'll pay you off. And in the case where he doesn't have money, at least pay me in land the value of the improvements over and above your mortgage. That's the chap here. Okay, let's look at Rashi. So Rashi, about maybe 10 lines into the narrower lines, Hinicha Lamanda Omar, Plukta hi biksubis. This Gemara that I just spoke to is a machlokes in ksubis, whether or not you can do that. If the buyer has money to pay the debt, according to one mandomer, he cannot kick out the creditor. Min ara the Baal Chov kadid. Why? What's the rationale? Because the Baal Chov happened first. What happened here? A man had a property, he borrowed money, and he pledged to a creditor. He says, I'm going to repay you on this land, but it's my land. Creditor said, fine. I'm going to come back this time next year. I'm going to collect my loan. Good. A year passes, nothing happens. The owner of the land sells it to a third person. Third person now owns it. Right. Reuben was the owner. Shimon is the Baal Chov. He sells it to Levi. Comes Shimon after a year. Here, look, I have a contract that says in a year I can come back and get my money. So who had Kedima here? Who was first in line? The Baal Chov, right? The creditor was first in line. He comes and says, oh, Reuben, you can't pay me? I'm taking the land. Oh, wait a minute. The land was sold to Levi. Sorry, I'm first in line. Says that Manda Omar in Ksubis. Yeah, you're right. He's first in line. Now, the Levi doesn't go uncompensated because it's not fair. He bought a piece of land. So he goes back to Reuven, collects the money, the $1,000 for the land, and turns over the land to Shimon. Now, Shimon has a piece of land, but he also has an improved piece of land. So the Gemara says, you know what? Shimon cannot benefit. He cannot be enriched from the improvement. He's got to pay for the improvement. But Levi says, I don't want the payment for the improvement. I want the land. Sorry, you're out of luck. The other Manda Omar, Shapir, now let's look at Rashi. So Rashi explains this situation. The Motzah Lemeimer, the Hechad Yesh Karka Moiser al Hakoiv, if you have karka which is worth more than the debt, im hashvach mesalik leil lokeach bezuze al korcha, the buyer can force the Baal Chov can force the buyer lokeach bezuze al korcha the lokeach v'lo mocha omer lokeach, and the buyer can't say havli min ara shir shvachi, give me from the land the value of my shvach, the Omer Kula Didi, because the mortgagee says, wait a minute, it's all mine. You're here without permission. Just because you bought it from the Reuven doesn't mean you have permission over me, the lender. That's one Manda Omar. The other Manda Omar says, no, that since a person buys it, when he buys it, he automatically has rights on that land. the rights of a purchaser, and the rights of a purchaser are above the rights of a creditor. In other words, Ruvain borrowed money from Shimon, fine, that's an obligation. But now Ruvain does a shtar mechira with Levi. He does a transaction with Levi. According to this Manda Omar, that transaction now takes precedence over anything else. So if the creditor comes and says, I want the land, and Levi has nothing but this land to his name, he's got to give him back the land, get back the money. But if he has money, he can redeem it. That's this Mandarma's halacha. And if he can redeem it, then he can redeem the portion of the field that he's entitled to for the shvach. Yeah, Scott.
Okay, so what portion of the land can he redeem? I want the middle section. I want the section on the edge. I want the one by the water. What section does he get?
Right. So now you ask a good question, and that's a separate discussion. You're right. What is he entitled to? Is he entitled to the best of the land? And remember, we had a discussion earlier in the Gemara about what obligations someone has with regard to paying back. Right? Remember what we said. We said that when it comes to paying back, then the scribe tells the seller, okay, let's anticipate something may happen. What are you going to do for payback? Are you going to give him the best of the land, the medium of the land, et cetera, et cetera? So the Chazal anticipated that question. It's not our subject of discussion here, but they anticipated that question as to, in other words, you have to enunciate in your shtar what you're paying back. Right? But it's a valid question. I'm just saying that it's a valid question, and that's something that the Gemara previously said that the seller needs to think about when this transaction happens, how, if something happens, how he's going to pay back, with what kind of land is he going to pay, the best of the land, not the best of the land, etc. So, okay, a valid question, and the Gemara already gave that answer previously. But with regard to our issue, it centers around the question of whether or not a buyer has any kedima. So this is a good kash on our Gemara. Ultimately, the point is that our Gemara says that the creditor can pay off the buyer and give him the money and kick him off the land. That doesn't work according to the Manda Omer that says a buyer has preference when it comes to a purchase over a creditor if he has the money. And if he doesn't have the money, the argument is, let me take a portion of the land equivalent to my money as if I had money, because you're going to pay me for the shvach. Instead of paying me in dollars, pay me in land. That's the kasha here. Okay?
Rabbi?
Yeah.
I haven't read ahead, so we're probably going to answer it, but what's the havamina that a more recent transaction can take priority over the earlier transaction? I mean, it's always been the first transaction has always taken precedence. So the creditor, he's got priority. So how can a more recent transaction, no matter how it's structured, how does that somehow take priority over the creditor who did his thing much earlier?
And that's a good question, because you would think you'd go in order of priority. The answer is you have to look at the transaction. A debt is meant to be temporary. A purchase is meant to be permanent. So when you weigh the two and you say, wait a minute, the debt, that was going to be for a year. I was going to repay. Changed circumstances, he can't pay. Okay, I get it. But a sale is forever. I'm selling you a piece of land, guy goes into height, take your land, and I'll take my money, and each of us will be happy. So the argument here is that land, even though it was later in time, still has a greater strength than something that was meant to be temporary. The kasha here is, if the buyer doesn't have means to pay off the creditor, right? He doesn't have means to pay off the creditor, what do? Then you're in a pickle, only because he doesn't have the means. So according to the Manda Omer that says, if he had the means, he could pay him off, right? So he'll pay him off. He doesn't have money, but he will have money because you're going to pay him for the shvach. you're paying for the shvach, he has money, then he is entitled to say, give me land, the value of the shvach, because you're going to give me money. That's the chap here.
Okay.
So this is the kasha.
Thank you.
It's an interesting kasha. This is the kasha on our Gemara. And so the Gemara ventures an answer and says, you know what? It's a good question, but hocha b'maya skinan, right for the two dots. You know what we're talking about? Going to ose apotike. He gave him an apotike. What is an apotike? The omalei lo yelecho peron ela mizo, where he says your only payment is from this land. So an apotike is a designated piece of land that is the only means of repayment. In other words, you can't go to another piece of land. You can't go to another source to get repayment. So the Gemara says, in a case where the land became the sole means of repayment, you can't now take it away from him and say, you know what? You were supposed to give me money for the shvach. I want a piece of land. No, you don't get that land. That land was solely designated to the Baal Chov. So where the Baal Chov had 100% right to the land, it's up to him to say, sure, I'll give you a piece of the land for money. But if he doesn't want to, you can't force him. So Rashi says, the Shavah Nehele, the Rashi title, that Lovel Baal Chov apotike lahai ara, he designated to the Baal Chov, the borrower, this land. V'hakol modin bezu, everybody, both Manda Omrim and Ksubis, agree the avalech zuze lelokeach lohava motzim misalik lei, that if the lokeach had money, he cannot say to the Baal Chov, I want a piece of the land. So in other words, apotike, and by the way, this apotike is an established principle in the Gemara that when you designate something solely to the person you're designating, no one can come and intervene and say, I want a piece of that. It's up to him, but you can't force your way in. So even though a purchase may have kedima over a chov, for the reason that we said before, because the lokeach is a permanent thing, so he has rights, that right accrues to him in any regular situation where he can go to the land. But where someone designated that land solely for the purpose of this loan, then even a purchase can't undo that. So Yale, to your point, a purchase has strength over a debt up to the point where the debt was designated solely from one piece of land. That purchaser, and that happens to be what he bought, right? He bought that land. Mm-hmm. He no longer has rights to that land. It was predetermined to be to the Baal Chov, and therefore the Baal Chov gets it without offset. But what does he have to do? He has to pay the shvach. He can't not pay the shvach, but he doesn't have to give up the land for it. So that's the conclusion of this Gemara. And now we've answered sort of the last question on Shmuel and Ribbis. And I believe we can turn the page, and Shmuel will still be an important player in our Gemara. But the issue of Ribbis, I think we've now put to rest, that we have answered all the questions on Ribbis as to how one can recover property, and it shouldn't be Ribbis. And the Mechzek Ribbis, like we said, we get around the Mechzek Ribbis by saying that in the case of a Gazlan, either it was predetermined that he would pay him, or the Gazlan has karka, he has land, and if he's repaying him land, it does not appear to be Ribbis, says the Gemara. Okay.
Rabbi, this debate was all taking place in Bavel, and presumably they were talking about land in their area. Is there a complication if the land is in Eretz Yisrael, where all the sales are presumed to be temporary because of Yovel, and there's always bias towards redemption of the land? Does that complicate all this debate and make it unique for Israel?
So the answer is, in principle, it would complicate it, but in order to allow for Mekach and Memker, even Eretz Yisrael, that's why we created the Pruzbul. So in other words, we created, just like we created Heter Iska for Ribbis, we created a Pruzbul for Yovel, so that a person should not Now, there are people who say, Pruzbul, okay, it's midrabanan, but really, Arid Eretz Yisrael, you shouldn't do that. Okay, those are different discussions. But for purposes of our discussion, if this happened in Eretz Yisrael, it wouldn't be different because of the Pruzbul. Otherwise, people would never transact because they would know after a period of time, it automatically goes back. Why should I even transact? I won't own the land. But it's a good point. Is that Eretz Yisrael is treated differently than Chutz La'aretz, right? Just like we treat Lahav, I mean, it's not Lahavdil, but just like we treat a Yid different than a Goy, except Mishum, Shalom Medina, that you shouldn't treat someone differently. But Lahalacha, just like Eretz Yisrael land is different, your dealings with the non-Jew is also different, but for, right? Yeah.
Question. I thought the Pruzbul was specifically about monetary debts, of various loans, but other things as well. But monetary stuff with Shemitah. Now, Shemitah stuff also applies to Yovel, but I didn't think it had anything to do with land issues.
Well, in Eretz Yisrael, if you notice, so again, maybe you didn't notice, is that when Yovel came and there was all these issues of land transactions, they had to find a way to justify that all the land shouldn't go back to the original owners, because that was a serious problem in Eretz Yisrael. Now, ultimately, you see, we have a different issue. The issue is that the Torah tells us that, and even by the Shvatim, that the land that was the designated, say, for Shevet Yehuda should always remain with Shevet Yehuda and shouldn't go to Shevet Yisachar, or vice versa, or any of the like. So in other words, land should always remain intact. So here you have a question: what happens if land was transacted and all of a sudden, so min haTorah, you can't. This is, and again, to David's question too. This is all temporary. Because min haTorah, you can't really trade land from one shevet to another, i.e., from one person to another, because that's a nachla, and a nachla cannot be transacted. The question here is, when we deal with land, how do we deal with land so that the Chazal, the Chachamim understood that land is an important commodity that has to be in commerce. So how do we deal with it? So in Eretz Yisrael, again, this is what happens in Eretz Yisrael, is that when Yovel comes, it doesn't wholesale go back unless they make a transaction, they resell it to him. However, they do it in Eretz Yisrael in order to make it valid. But as a practical matter, land doesn't go back even in Yovel, because that upends the whole system. It's only midrabanan, midaraisa. Again, in the time of Mashiach, this will all be sort of straightened out. But at least for our purposes now, we say that land still can remain in the hands of someone who purchased it, even when Yovel comes, and there isn't an automatic right with Manazet.
Maybe a practical, real-world analog today, Hong Kong. 99-year lease. It's like 50 years till YOLO. 99 years, it's forever, and they build it up and everything else, and then all of a sudden, what do we do? It's going back, and it went back. And
Correct. And by the way, we have 99-year leases in this country. You know that there are properties. I was involved in one years ago where a property was sold, but a portion of the property, which was an easement, was only a 99-year easement. If it's a 99-year easement, and we're now 99 is forever. We're halfway there. We're more than halfway there. So at some point in time, someone's going to come to collect that easement. And what are you going to do? So you're right. That's exactly the point, is that technically, al pi halacha, property is not forever. You can't sell property forever. Al pi halacha, you can't. But maybe the 99 years in our case, Menashe is going to be more than 99. It'll be up to the time of Mashiach. When Mashiach comes, then it'll revert. Then that's our 99. Our 99 years is dependent on the coming of Mashiach. But it's an important question, because as a practical matter, we live in a time when there are certain rules that govern interactions between people and commerce. And if those actions, if the Chazal, if Halacha can upend those transactions, it creates chaos. And the Chachamim don't want to create chaos. They don't want to create situations where Mishum Tikkun Olam or Shalom, the Olam, I should say, that people will start having machlokes. What do you mean? I bought the land. It's my land. No, I only gave it to you temporarily. So these are, again, we rely on our poskim to give us the answers on how to deal with these. But as a practical matter, yes, this was in Bavel. I guess if you look at the Rishalmi, maybe the Rishalmi will give us a different answer for Eretz Yisrael, David. So maybe we have to take a look at the Rishalmi on this issue. All right. So we turn to a very interesting question now. And so up till now, we've said that when a Goslin forges let's say a deed and sells it, Reuven is the Goslin, he sells it to Shimon, Shimon is unaware. And when he becomes aware, then he has certain rights. Zak the Gemara Azay, and the two dies. Hikar borsha ena shalo v'lakcha. What happens if Shimon knows that Reuven stole the land, that he forged the deed? So in other words, Shimon is buying a piece of land knowing in advance that that land was stolen. Now it's a different story. What rights does Shimon have? He's not an innocent victim, right? Because he says, okay, I mean, he's not going to deny that he didn't know it. So what happens here? Says the Gemara like this. Say machlokes Rav and Shmuel. Omer Rav, Mo'os Yeshlo Shvach Ein Lo. What did Rav say previously? If he didn't know in advance and now it comes back, he's entitled to his money and Shvach. Here Rav says no. Mo'os Yeshlo Shvach Ein Lo. He's entitled to the money for his property, even though he knew it was stolen. What does that mean he's entitled? Not from the owner of the land. He can go back to the Goslin and say to the Goslin, you must reimburse me for the value of my land because it was stolen. The Goslin would say, but you knew it was stolen when you bought it. He says, no. Rav says no dice. He's still entitled to his land, but he can't claim any improvements that he made on the land. V'Shmuel Omer afilu mos ein lo. And Shmuel says, you know what? This is a sort of a penalty. He can't even claim his land because he did it with knowledge of forethought. He bought a piece of land that was stolen. He thought, let's say the land was worth $2,000 and he bought it for $1,000. So he bought a Metzia, right? He bought a discounted piece of land that was stolen. So Shmuel says, we're not giving you any benefits now. You knew what you were buying. You lost it. Sorry, you lost it. And you can't even go back to the Goslin because you knew it. So Shmuel is being very tough here and is saying that you can't even get. So says Rashi, Heker bo lokeach b'karka zu, the buyer recognized this land she'ena shalo shel mocher, that it's not that doesn't belong to the seller, shegezulo hoisa etzlo, that it was stolen, the lakha, and he bought it stolen property. So it's almost like today in our circumstance. What do we say if someone buys on the black market a property of, let's say, whatever it is, jewelry or property or whatever it happens to be, and then it gets confiscated by the government, and he says, wait a minute, I have rights here. They say, what kind of rights? You knew that this was gray area property. In fact, we're going to prosecute you. But if we don't prosecute you, just go home because you're not entitled to anything, right? So in modern day circumstance, this is what happens in real life. Is a buyer who buys with knowledge of a forethought takes a big risk. So Rav says, Mos yeshlo min hamocher, from the seller, when the real owner comes and takes the property back, he can still go to the seller. Shvach ein lo, but he can't collect shvach. Shekarka zeh ein kunuyalo. He never was kona the karka, so anything that grew on the karka wasn't his because he wasn't kona it. He didn't acquire it. It was stolen. That's Rav. Shmuel, on the other hand, penalizes him and says you can't collect anything. So now the Gemara is trying to understand what's the basis of the machlokes between Rav and Shmuel? Okay, let's understand the machlokes between Rav and Shmuel. But my kamiflage, says the Gemara, what is the circumstance of the argument between between Rav and Shmuel? But my kamiflage. So the Gemara says as follows: Rav Sova Adam Yodea Shekarka Ein Lo. Rav said the buyer knew that the karka doesn't belong to the seller. So underlying, Rav says that the buyer's intent was really to give the money as a deposit for the seller to hold on to. In other words, he had this $1,000. For some reason, he wanted it out of his possession. We won't go into why. We'll say that he wanted it out of his possession. So he wanted someone to be the shomer, let's say, for his money. So he wanted Reuven to be the shomer. So he disguised the bikadon in the form of a sale. Why? So Rashi says, okay, well, we'll see in a minute. The point is, he wanted him to hold it as a bikadon. That's why he gave it to him. Frek the Gemara, v'neimele l'shum bikadon. Why do you say it was a sale? Why doesn't the Gemara say that he gave it to Reuven as a bikadon? And that's why Rav says he gets it back, because it was only a deposit. Why does Rav have this mask and say, you know what? It's really a bikadon, but I'm going to call it a sale. Call it a bikadon. And for the Gemara, sover lo mekabel. So Rashi says lo mekabel lishmor. In other words, his intent was for Reuven to be a shomer, but he knew that Reuven would not accept the responsibility of being a shomer, and he was desperate. He needed him to, so he disguised it as a sale, but he didn't mean it as a sale. So that's Rav's reason underlying why he says the money goes back. The shvach doesn't go back, but the money goes back because it was never intended as a sale. It was intended as a pikado.
Rabbi?
Yes.
So just to be clear, so you have Reuven and Shimon. Reuven has a piece of stolen property. Shimon wants to purchase. Shimon wants to deposit $1,000 with Reuven, who he knows is a thief, and is trying to sell stolen property. From a business point of view, that doesn't really, of all the people that he's choosing to watch his money, somebody who's trying to sell stolen property doesn't seem to be the logical choice.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you.
It sounds like money laundering here or something.
you know something, you're all right. This sounds like a very, very shady transaction between two people.
Well, he told him in advance the money was a steal.
Oh, you bet.
Sorry.
Again, Chaim, you're being generous.
Sober, yes.
Yeah. In other words, you can give roots of all of that, and you're all right. Why would this go down this way? L'chayra, it shouldn't go down this way. But Rav is being down lekap schus that he liked Shimon, and he said, okay, I know Shimon isn't going to do me dirty. I want him to hold it for me. So you're right. You can say, why give it to a thief? Why give it to a thief? So let me give you an illustration of something that happened. It's a real life story, and it's an interesting story. Many, many years ago in New York, there was a circumstance where there was a Jew who was attacked when he was holding money. And the attacker, so he was falling to the ground, and the attacker didn't realize he was holding the money, so he ran away. People came, they called the authorities. This person, this is a real true story. So the person was afraid that if he was going to be taken to the hospital, someone would take the money, he would never see the money again. Quite simply, someone would steal the money from him. So he turned to someone, that someone happened to be my father-in-law. He turned to someone and he said to him, take my money, take my money. In other words, he trusted him to take his money. It turns out he didn't actually know him well, but he was afraid that he would be robbed So he told someone who he thought he trusted, take my money. The story ended well because the guy recovered and my father gave him back the money. But to the point that he could have said to him, money? What money? Where's money? I mean, there was no shtar, there was no transaction, there was nothing. So he could have taken the money and there would not have been any recourse. So I'm not saying it's on point, but when you think about it, he has a good friend. Okay, he trusts him. The fact that he did this transaction to him doesn't bode well, but it doesn't necessarily take away from the fact that he was someone who he knew, and he knew that he might not hold the money for him, but he needed to get rid of the money. And it could have been for a legitimate reason. I'm not saying it was an ulterior thing. Maybe they're both ganavim, so one ganav to another ganav. Who knows? But the fact that he gave him the money, right? The fact that he gave it the money.
Honor among thieves.
What's that, David?
There's an expression, there's honor among thieves.
Honor among thieves. There you go. So he gave him the money as he picotted. So anyway, we understand Rav's position. Rav is saying that underneath this, it wasn't a monetary transaction of a buy and a sell, it was a picotton. However we shade it, it was 100% kosher, not 100% kosher. But Rav is saying, if it was a picotton, he's entitled to his money back. That's the point. Now, let's look at further in the Gemara. Shmuel holds, Onam Yodea Shekarka Ein Lo. He knew that it wasn't the seller's karka. He knew it was stolen. That the underlying reason why he gave it to Reuven is because Reuven was a friend of his, so he gave him a matana. He gave him as a gift. The Gemara of matana. Why this subterfuge that it was a sale? Let him say it was a matana. And for the Gemara, Milsa, he was embarrassed. He was embarrassed, as Rashi says. He was embarrassed to tell him, I want to give you a matana. So he cloaked it in the form of a purchase. He knew that Reuven, that he was buying stolen property, but he wanted to give him a matana, so he called it a purchase. And Rashi said, and the Gemara says, because he was embarrassed. Again, by our standards, this sounds like a very unorthodox kind of transaction. So, but in order to understand the underlying positions of Rav and Shmuel, the Gemara says, to Rav it was a picotton, to Shmuel it was a matana. So now we understand, if it was a picotton according to Rav, therefore Rav says he's entitled to his money, but not shvach. If according to Shmuel it was a matana, now we understand why he's not even entitled to the money, because he gave him the money as a gift. So he was never coming to reclaim the money. Therefore, if the transaction went sideways, you don't collect the money, because according to Shmuel, it was a matana. Okay, that's the underlying principle that is important for us to understand. So, okay, so fine, that's the machlekes. So the Gemara has a different taina here. Wait a minute. This is deja vu. This machlekes between Rav and Shmuel. Rav says that it's a picotton. Shmuel says it's a matana. We heard this story once before, where the Gemara in Kedushin says, "Well, palgebe palgebe chodazimna." They already discussed this. The Itmar we learned. The Rashi says it's the Gemara in Kedushin. Hamakadosh is achosa. A person who is Mekadosh his sister. What? His sister? We know you can't be Mekadosh your sister, right? So, but he wanted to be Mekadosh his sister, and he gave the money, right? Bizarre circumstance. Rav Omar Mos Chosrin, in that Gemara, Rav says the money goes back to the brother. Shmuel Amar Maus Matana. And Shmuel says, it doesn't go back because it's a matana. So what's the case there? So we'll say the Gemara and then we'll articulate it. Rav Omar Mos Chosem Adamidesh in Kedushin Tovsim Ba'achosa. A brother cannot marry a sister of the Torah, and there's an Issa Kores. Torah says a brother can't marry a sister. Okay, so there's an Isser Kores Now the question is, with an halacha, le'isa kares, what does that mean? So Rav says, Adam yodeya she'en kedushin tovsum ba'choso. Of course he knows that he can't marry his sister. It's an issa kares, you can't. In other words, kedushin is not chal on an issa kares. So why did he do it? Says the Gemara, he gave his sister a deposit to hold the money. Frek the Gemara there in Kedushin v'neimele l'shum pikadon. Why doesn't the Gemara say he gave it to his sister as a pikadon? Sava lo makabla. Same thing. He knew that she probably wouldn't hold on to the money, so he had to do a subterfuge so his sister would hold on to the money. So in the subterfuge, he says, I'm marrying you. He knew it wasn't a marriage. Of course he knew it wasn't a marriage, it's kares. That's Rav's position. In that Gemara, Shmuel Omer Moris Matana. Adam Yodeya she'en kedushin tovsum ba'choso, v'gama v'nosan l'shum matana. He knew, and he gave it to her for matana. V'neim alei l'shum matana. Frank the Gemara, why didn't he give her an outright gift? And for the Gemara, kesef alei milsa, that she would be embarrassed to take the gift. Same circumstance as ours, except that it's about marrying a sister. So that same Gemara was there. The kasha is, what's different about our Gemara? In other words, the Gemara isn't just going to repeat it for the sake of repeating it. The same circumstance and the same position. In other words, one, he marries his sister. One, he buys a stolen field. Rav says it's a pekadon. Shmuel says it's a matana. Same difference. Why do we need both of those circumstances? Now, that's the point here, is that the kasha is, you're telling me a chiddush that Rav says that you get it back because he knew it, but he was a pekadon. And Shmuel says it's a matana. We already know that story. That story was told to us in Kedushin. So what's the chiddush here? What is the Gemara telling us here that we don't know? And for the Gemara, so we'll answer the Gemara. So the Gemara says, Shricha. We need to have both circumstances, the circumstance of stolen property and the circumstance of the marriage of the sister, which is an improper marriage. Why? Because if we only have our Gemara, which is the case of the stolen property, you know why Rav says it's a pikadon? Because a person doesn't give gifts to strangers, right? But in the case of the sister marrying a sister, maybe in that case, Rav doesn't say it's a pikadon. He said that he admits to Shmuel because why? Someone would give a gift to a family member, a sister. So in other words, you can't know if the Gemara in Kedushin didn't tell us that Rav holds that it's a pikadon in the case of the marriage of a sister, you would think no. In that case, Rav's reasoning has nothing to do with pikadon. He agrees with Shmuel it's a matana, because only in the case of a stranger, where you're buying a piece of property from someone else, even if it's a friend, but it's not a blood relative, so you don't give gifts out of the blue. Therefore, it's a pikadon. But he would not say pikadon in the case of a sister. So therefore, for Rav, we have to have both cases to tell us that in both cases, even with a sister, it's a pikadon, right? Okay, so the it mebahach, and if we only have the case, the mebahach, and if we only have the case of the sister, then okay, we understand Shmuel says that it's a matana because you give matanas to a family member, but in the case of a stolen property, he doesn't say that. He says it's a matana. So you want to go ahead and you want to say that the reasoning behind this is consistent in both. If we didn't have both Bryce, both Gemaras, we wouldn't know one from the other, right? So this is a tangent to our underlying principle of Rav saying you collect money and Shmuel says you don't collect money, but we're trying to understand the reasoning. And the reasoning we gave was because Rav says it's a pikadon, Shmuel says it's a matana. Correct the Gemara, we know that already. What's the chiddush? And for the Gemara, it's a chiddush because if you didn't have both cases, then you might have Rav admitting to Shmuel in one and Shmuel admitting to Rav in the other, because they're not parallel cases. One has to do with a sister. Marrying a sister is forbidden, but it's a sister to whom you have a relationship. You'd want to give a matana. And in the case of a gazlan, then since over there a person doesn't give gifts to strangers, Shmuel says, no, I don't hold it's a gift. I hold it's a precaution. So that's the kasha of the Gemara. So the answer is that we need both prices, because if we didn't have both prices, then we would not know the outcome of that Gemara. So now we need both cases. So, okay, Frank the Gemara, just to conclude this thought, Frank the Gemara, if that's the case, then Bein l'Rav dom l'Pikadon, Bein l'Shmuel dom l'Matana, whether it's so according to one, it's all subterfuge. It's never meant to be a purchase and a sale in our Gemara. It's all subterfuge, either Pikadon or Matana. Frank the Gemara, if it's all subterfuge, Bein l'Rav dom l'Pikadon, Bein l'Shmuel dom l'Matana, Hay la'ara b'mayin konochis uperis heicha ochel. How does this person go in and work the land and eat the fruit? You're telling me that it was a subterfuge for something else, and that something else either was a pikadon or a matana. Then by what right does he go into the field and work the field, improve the field, and eat the fruit? Now he's a gazlan. He's a gazlan. Is the Gemara telling us that with this subterfuge he's allowed to go ahead and steal someone else's property? Right? So the kasha backfires on the guy. According to Rav, the whole thing is a subterfuge because it's a pikadon. According to Shmuel, it's a whole subterfuge because it's really a matana. And the reason why you don't announce it is that Rav says because he wouldn't take it. Shmuel says he wouldn't take it, she wouldn't take it because of embarrassment. So what's he doing taking the food? What's he doing wanting to acquire the property and eat from it? It's not his. He's not allowed to do that. So on the surface, it seems to be a stira. On the one hand, Rav says he has good motive, good intention, and Shmuel says he has good intention. On the other hand, he's doing something improper. He's eating the property. You're not allowed to do that. If you're giving a matana, how do you go ahead and give a matana and then eat from it? Or a pikadon, vice versa. So the kashi is Bein l'Rav and pikadon Shmuel and matana. Hay la'ara b'may konochos uperis heicha ochel, says Rashi. Rashi says most chozon hakadushin chozon. Bein l'Rav da Omer kloma heichel metzina lo metama de Rav mishum de gama v'nosel l'shum pikadon. The time of the Shmuel mishum de gama v'nosel mishum matana. We have a date lechad mahanach. If that was his intention, heicha havenochis lahai ara leuvda. How does he go down and work the field? V'lechel perisera, right? He wouldn't do it. Says Rashi, al korka sova shahoya make sova hoya shiya meiche kayam. You can't argue that it was a subterfuge. He must have thought that he was actually buying it. You want to give him a defense, a cover, and say he wasn't buying it, he was doing something else. Rashi says you can't do that. That wouldn't happen. He was really wanting to buy it, says Rashi. And he was not a baki here. That the halacha is you can't buy stolen property. He was a man of the village. He didn't know halacha, so he bought from a gazlan and he thought it was okay. The Talmud looked at Rav Shmuel Tamachrinahi, and Rav and Shmuel had nothing to do with this Gemara. So in other words, we're now trying to slug up the distinction between Rav and Shmuel by saying it can't be, because otherwise, how would this person knowingly steal the property that isn't his? So we have to find a teretz to that, because on the surface it looks like Rav and Shmuel are really not relevant to this Gemara. And for the Gemara, Sova ana eches la'ara ve'eved ve'echel ve'gave. So this is now what we call the ultimate in rationalizing. So the Gemara is going to rationalize. So what he knew it wasn't proper. And therefore Rav and Shmuel, their cover is intact. It's totally intact. He knew it wasn't proper. Why did he do it? Says the Gemara, Sobra Ana Eches La'ara, the Avid. I'll go down to the land and I'll work it. The Echel Begavei, Keheche Dahaviko Ovid Iu. I'll just substitute myself for the Gazlan. What was the Gazlan doing? The Gazlan forged the document and he sat there and he was eating the fruit. So he was a Gazlan. So this guy is coming along and he's saying, I'm doing nothing worse than what the Gazlan did. But let me kick the Gazlan off the field. Let me get him off the field and I'll eat it. L'chi osa mare de are zuza neheva l'rav domet pikadon l'shmuel matana. So listen to this rationalization. He's rationalizing by saying the following. I'm going to go down to this field and I'm going to eat from it. I'm doing nothing worse than the Gazlan did. The Gazlan had no intention of paying anybody back. So let me at least kick him off the field and let me take over the field. Now, if the buyer never comes back, okay, now I paid for land and I'm eating from the land. If the original guy comes back, then what's going to happen here? Then I'll say it was a cover, but it's no worse than if the Gazlan had taken it. So we're rationalizing. Now, you can rationalize all day. Of course, the question is it proper? But the Gemara is showing us that the rationalization in essence means that the person is saying, I am no worse than the person from whom I'm buying it, who would never have paid anything back in recovery. At least I have some cover. It's not a satisfying answer by any means, but that's how the Gemara rationalizes it and saying that the fellow is saying that I bought the land. I justified that I am not eating stolen fruit. It's fruit from the poison tree because someone else stole it. Okay, maybe it's not the best example of someone's yichus. That his yichus is that he bought stolen land and he ate the fruit, not the best yichus. But nevertheless, he's saying that from my standpoint, I did nothing. If anything, I sort of did something a little bit better because I paid for it, A, and B, if it ever came to pass that the real owner came, then I can actually sort of say, you know what, I'm sitting here because it's not really, I'll pay you for the fruit I ate, but it's a pekadon that I gave him, or I'll pay you for the fruit because I gave someone else a matana. So we're justifying what he did is because he is going to somehow reimburse the real owner, even if he lets the seller, the Gazlan, free. In other words, the matana is to the Gazlan, not to the new owner. He's not giving the new owner a matana. He'll repay him maybe for the fruit that he ate, so he won't be out the fruit. But it's the matana he gave to the Gazlan. Why he would give the Gazlan a matana? Okay, that's between him and the Gazlan. Rav's reason is that it's a pikadon, so he expects it back from the Gazlan, and while he's holding it, he's eating from the fruit. So it's a little bit of a submission to teretz, but nevertheless, the Gemara says it's a perfectly acceptable way for the buyer to transact. Again, not necessarily what you would teach your children, but the Gemara is trying to give a teretz as to how Rav and Shmuel fit in here. So let's take a look at Rashi. The ha'ovid hagazim the Rav the omed pikadon kloma aliba the Rav meforshin in the high meima omed zuze neheve pikadon the Shmuel mefrishin the high omed zuze neheve matana. All right. So in other words, again, the kasha is probably better than the teretz, which oftentimes we don't understand, right? But at least he's giving him a teretz, and he's saying that he'll compensate the owner, but he didn't mean necessarily to buy it. It was really either a pekadon or a matana. So that's how the Gemara answers it, and also says that you have to have both Gemaras, the one in Ksubit, our Gemara here and the one in Kedushin, because Rav Lishitoso, Shmuel Lishitoso, that Rav is consistent. And if we didn't have both Gemaras, we would think he's not consistent. And the same for Shmuel. So we'll stop here. Again, maybe you'll have to take this with us for the week. It's maybe then again, I'd like to end on a stronger note, but the Gemara at least gives some kind of a justification as to why it's appropriate. So
Only as good as your material, Rabbi.
What's that?
You're only as good as your material.
Only as good as my material, right? So Mitzvah will pick up from Omar Rava, but again, to understand just the seichel of the Gemara is that the Gemara uses this logic to help us understand to some degree how the Chachamim think. So if you hold like Rav, that it was a pikadon, so he never intended to transact with a Gazlan. So the kasha is, why did he transact with him? If it was really only a pikadon, how does he go and eat from the fruit? The teretz is, when you think about it, is the Gazlan would never reimburse the original owner. He at least is trying to do the right thing. He's buying it from the Gazlan and he's giving him, in his mind, money if the pikadon. How does he go ahead and eat from it? He justifies it by saying, if the Gazlan had done it, he would have been doing it ad infinitum and never reimburse it.
Yeah, he's no worse off. The landowner is no worse off.
Is no worse off than if I have it. Correct. So from the landowner's point, that's a very good point. He's no worse off. And if anything, he might be somewhat better because at least this guy is honorable and might give him some money.
Both of these are counting on the owner not coming back.
He's counting on the owner not coming back because for all he knows, the owner died or right. Exactly right. So he said, why should the Gazlan eat it? I'll eat it. Okay. Now, in the case of Shmuel, it's a little bit different because Shmuel is willing to give a matana to this Gazlan. He's willing to give him a gift and it not be just a temporary transaction. So here, he must like Reuben a lot because he's saying, I'm going to give you a gift. And therefore, if the real owner does come back, I'm out of luck. So that's a little bit harder to understand. It's a little bit easy to understand Rav, that it's a pikadon, so at least he's not hurting himself. In the case of Shmuel, where he's giving him a gift, he's giving him a gift, and he's a Gazlan. He's losing the land because the real owner may come back. So that's a little bit more shaky as to how to understand. But that's why Shmuel.
The risks are different between two cases.
But we're trying to understand why Shmuel takes such a very tough position that you're out of luck, you get nothing back. Why get nothing back? At least in the case of Rav, Rav is saying that the guy can get his money back, not his improvement, but his money back. Shmuel is much more stringent, and we'll see that in all cases, Shmuel is more. When we look at the Gemara next week, we'll understand that Shmuel is much more stringent than Rav in every case. And to give you a sneak peek, the halacha is not like Shmuel. The halacha is not like Shmuel in any of the things that Shmuel has said because of his stringency. And the Gemara wants to say that, no, we don't want to be that stringent. But again, for our purposes, this is how we'll end the Gemara, that's the justification for what we do. So next week we'll pick it up. And again, now we're going to talk about interesting circumstances with respect, at least in the next few Gemaras, about what happens if someone steals and sells. It gets very interesting as we go further. Nothing to do with ribbis anymore. I think we turned that page, but now we're looking into a whole new different focus. So unless Mashiach comes, unless Eliyahu Navi comes and gives us the answers to all of these questions that we have some doubt with, we will pick up next week, Mr. Shem, from here.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Yeah.